One question in a bakery, and the entire room went silent. "Is there any expired cake? It's my son's birthday." The thin man stood at the counter, his hand gripping an empty wallet, eyes refusing to meet the employee's gaze. What came back were looks of contempt, cold mockery, and a dismissal without mercy. But they didn't know that right behind him, the most powerful woman in the city had heard everything. And in just one afternoon, her decision would change a father's life forever. Could kindness reverse fate in a few short hours? Jacob Miller pushed through the glass door of Belmont Patisserie just after 3 in the afternoon. The bell above the entrance chimed soft and delicate, a sound that didn't belong to him. Inside, everything gleamed. White marble counters stretched beneath glass cases, filled with cakes that looked like they'd been painted by hand. The air smelled like butter and sugar and something expensive he couldn't name. He stood just inside the doorway, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his work jacket. The fabric was stained near the cuffs, dirt from the construction site he'd been let go from 2 days ago. He hadn't told Leo yet. There was no point in worrying a 6-year-old about things he couldn't fix. Jacob had spent the morning applying to 3 different jobs, all of them temporary, all of them paying just enough to keep the lights on for another month. But today wasn't about the lights. Today was Leo's birthday, and Jacob had promised him a cake. Not a cupcake from the gas station, not a box of donuts. A real cake, the kind other kids got. The kind Leo's mother would have bought if she were still here. Jacob moved toward the counter slowly, his boots too loud against the polished floor. A young woman stood behind the register, her hair tied back in a neat ponytail, her apron spotless. She glanced up at him and her smile faltered, just slightly, before she reset it into something polite and distant. 2 other customers stood near the far end of the counter, a well-dressed couple examining a 3-tier wedding cake sample. They didn't look at him. No one ever did in places like this. Jacob was used to it. He was 35 years old, lean in the way that came from skipping meals, and his hands were calloused from years of lifting steel beams and pouring concrete. He didn't fit here. He knew that. But Leo's birthday only came once a year, and this year, it landed on the same day Jacob's wife had died 2 years ago. Emma had been gone for 730 days, and Leo still asked about her every night before bed. Jacob didn't know how to answer those questions anymore. He didn't know how to fill the space she'd left behind, but he could get his son a birthday cake. He could do that much. He stepped up to the counter. The employee looked at him with raised eyebrows, waiting. Jacob opened his mouth, then closed it. He'd rehearsed this in his head on the walk over, but now the words felt too small, too humiliating to say out loud. He glanced down at the wallet in his hand. Inside were 2 $10 bills and a handful of coins. It wasn't enough for any of the cakes in the display. He knew that before he walked in. Jacob cleared his throat. The sound felt too loud. He looked up at the young woman and forced the words out before he could stop himself. "Is there any expired cake? It's my son's birthday." The question hung in the air like smoke. The employee blinked at him, her expression shifting from polite confusion to something colder. Her name tag read, Sarah. She tilted her head slightly, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. "I'm sorry, what?" Sarah's voice was sharp now, the politeness gone. Jacob swallowed. His throat felt dry. He tried again, quieter this time, hoping that would somehow make it less shameful. "I was just wondering if you had any cakes that are about to expire, or ones that didn't sell. It's my son's 6th birthday, and I just thought maybe." Sarah cut him off with a short, humorless laugh. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked him up and down, slow and deliberate. Like she was cataloging every stain on his jacket, every worn seam in his jeans. "We don't sell trash here," Sarah said. Her voice carried across the bakery, loud enough that the couple near the wedding cake turned to look. Jacob felt his face go hot. He kept his eyes on the counter, on the smooth white marble that reflected nothing back at him. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her tone dropping into something quieter, but meaner. "If you can't afford cake, maybe birthdays aren't for you." The words hit him like a fist to the chest. Jacob's hands tightened around his wallet. He wanted to say something back, wanted to defend himself, to explain that he wasn't asking for charity, just for something small, something that wouldn't go to waste anyway. But the words wouldn't come. They never did in moments like this. Behind him, someone laughed. It was soft, barely audible, but Jacob heard it. He didn't turn around. He just nodded once, a quick jerk of his head, and took a step back from the counter. His boots scraped against the floor. He turned toward the door, ready to leave, ready to go back to the apartment and figure out some other way to make Leo smile today. But then a voice stopped him. It was calm, measured, and it didn't belong to Sarah. "Excuse me." Jacob froze. He turned halfway, just enough to see who had spoken. A woman stood a few feet behind him, near the display of cream puffs and fruit tarts. She was tall, dressed in a dark coat that looked tailored, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she didn't have time for anything unnecessary. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were fixed on Sarah, with the kind of intensity that made the room feel smaller. The woman stepped forward. She didn't look at Jacob. She walked past him, her heels clicking against the floor, and stopped directly in front of the counter. Sarah straightened immediately, her expression shifting from smug to uncertain in less than a second. The woman spoke again, her voice still calm, but there was something beneath it now, something that made Sarah's hands drop to her sides. "I'd like to see all of your freshest cakes," the woman said. She didn't ask. She stated it like a fact, like there was no other possible response. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it. She glanced at Jacob, then back at the woman, and her face went pale. Recognition flickered across her features. Whoever this woman was, Sarah knew her. Or at least, knew of her. "Of course, Ms. Whitmore," Sarah stammered. Her hands fumbled for a small bell on the counter, and she rang it twice. Another employee appeared from the back, an older man in a white chef's coat, and Sarah whispered something to him quickly before turning back to the woman with a forced smile. Jacob stood frozen near the door. He didn't know what was happening. He didn't know who this woman was, or why she'd stepped in. But the air in the bakery had changed. The couple near the wedding cake had stopped talking. The room had gone quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like everyone was holding their breath. The woman, Ms. Whitmore, didn't look at Jacob. She kept her eyes on Sarah, waiting. And Sarah, for the first time since Jacob had walked in, looked like she wanted to disappear. The chef emerged from the back room carrying a silver tray lined with cake samples. Each one was pristine, decorated with edible flowers and gold leaf that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. He set the tray down on the counter in front of Claire Whitmore, with the careful reverence of someone handling museum artifacts. Sarah stood beside him, her earlier confidence completely gone. She kept her hands clasped in front of her, fingers twisting together, and her eyes darted between Claire and the cakes, like she was trying to anticipate what would happen next. The couple who had been examining the wedding cake had moved closer, no longer pretending to mind their own business. Claire leaned forward slightly, examining each cake with the same quiet focus she'd used when speaking. Her expression didn't change. She didn't smile or nod or give any indication of what she was thinking. After a long moment, she straightened and gestured toward a 3-layer chocolate cake with raspberry filling visible between the dark layers. "This one," Claire said. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but it carried weight. Sarah nodded quickly and reached for the cake, but Claire held up one hand. "I'll need it personalized." Sarah's hand froze mid-reach. She looked up at Claire with confusion, written plainly across her face. "Of course, Miss Whitmore. What would you like it to say?" Claire turned then, for the first time since she'd stepped forward, and looked directly at Jacob. He was still standing near the door, his wallet clutched in both hands now, his face caught somewhere between embarrassment and disbelief. He hadn't moved. He wasn't sure he could. "What's your son's name?" Claire asked him. Her tone was softer now, but it still held that same underlying firmness, like she expected an answer and wouldn't accept silence. Jacob's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. He had to force the words up through his throat. "Leo," he managed finally. "His name is Leo." Claire nodded once, then turned back to Sarah. "Write Happy Birthday Leo on it. 6 candles." Sarah blinked at her, then at Jacob, then back at Claire. 6 candles, she repeated slowly, as if trying to make sense of the instructions. "And should I?" "6 candles," Claire said again, cutting her off. "The number matters." The chef had already disappeared back into the kitchen. Sarah stood frozen for another beat, then turned and hurried after him, nearly tripping over her own feet in her rush to comply. The couple near the wedding cake exchanged glances, but said nothing. The bakery had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that felt like everyone was afraid to breathe too loud. Jacob took a tentative step forward. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, like the floor had turned to something less solid. He stopped a few feet away from Claire, close enough to speak without raising his voice, but far enough that he didn't feel like he was intruding on whatever space she occupied. "Ma'am, I appreciate what you're doing, but I can't," Jacob started, his voice low and rough. He had to clear his throat before he could continue. "I can't accept this. I didn't come here to... I wasn't trying to..." Claire turned to face him fully. Up close, Jacob could see that she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe in her early 40s, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. She didn't look angry or annoyed. She didn't look sympathetic either. She just looked at him like she was reading something written on his face that he hadn't meant to show. "You came here to get your son a birthday cake," Claire said. It wasn't a question. "That's exactly what you're going to do." Jacob shook his head, the movement small and almost involuntary. "I didn't come here for charity. I just thought maybe there was something that wasn't going to sell anyway, something that would have been thrown out. I wasn't trying to..." "I know what you were trying to do," Claire said, her voice still even. "And I know what she said to you." She glanced toward the kitchen where Sarah had disappeared, then back at Jacob. "This isn't charity. This is a birthday cake for a 6-year-old boy. Nothing more complicated than that." Jacob felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd been holding closed for a long time. He looked down at his hands, at the wallet he'd been gripping so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. $20 and some coins. That's what he had to his name until the unemployment check came through next week. $20, and he'd been willing to spend all of it on day-old bread shaped like a cake if it meant keeping his promise to Leo. "I can't pay for that cake," Jacob said quietly. The admission felt like swallowing glass. "I don't have enough." Claire didn't respond right away. She just watched him, and Jacob couldn't tell if she was judging him or measuring him or something else entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its edge. "Then don't pay for it," Claire said simply. "I already am." The words hung between them. Jacob's first instinct was to refuse again, to walk out of the bakery with whatever dignity he had left and figure out some other way to make Leo's birthday special. But he couldn't move. His feet stayed planted on the polished floor, and his mind kept circling back to the image of Leo's face when he came home. The way his son's eyes would light up if Jacob walked through the door carrying a real birthday cake, the kind with layers and frosting and candles that needed to be blown out while making a wish. Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying the chocolate cake on a pristine white cake board. It was beautiful, almost obscenely so, with fresh raspberries arranged in a perfect circle on top and 6 small candles placed evenly around the edge. Written in elegant script across the top layer were the words, "Happy Birthday, Leo," in dark chocolate icing that gleamed under the bakery lights. She set it down on the counter with exaggerated care, then stepped back and folded her hands in front of her. Her earlier smugness had been replaced by something that looked like fear, though she was trying hard to hide it behind a professional smile. "Is this acceptable, Ms. Whitmore?" Sarah asked. Her voice came out higher than usual, strained at the edges. Claire walked over to the counter and examined the cake. She circled it slowly, looking at it from every angle, and Jacob watched her face for any sign of approval or disappointment. He saw neither. After what felt like an eternity, Claire straightened and nodded. "It's perfect," Claire said. Then she turned to Sarah, and her expression hardened just slightly. "I assume you'll be putting this in a proper box with handles, given that this customer has a 6-year-old waiting at home." Sarah's professional smile faltered. "Of course, Ms. Whitmore." "Right away." She disappeared again, this time into a storage closet near the back, and returned with a large white bakery box and a roll of ribbon. Her hand shook slightly as she transferred the cake into the box, and she fumbled twice with the ribbon before managing to tie it into a decent bow. When she finished, she pushed the box across the counter toward Claire, but Claire didn't touch it. "Give it to him," Claire said, nodding toward Jacob. Sarah's eyes widened. She looked at Jacob, then at Claire, then back at Jacob again. For a moment, Jacob thought she might refuse, might say something cutting or cruel just to salvage whatever power she thought she still had. But she didn't. She picked up the box and held it out toward Jacob with both hands, her arms stiff and her face carefully blank. Jacob stepped forward and took the box. It was heavier than he expected, solid and real in his hands. The ribbon felt smooth against his fingers. He looked down at it, at the white cardboard and the neat bow, and something in his throat went tight. "I'm sorry," Sarah said suddenly. The words came out rushed and clumsy, like she'd been holding them back and they'd finally broken free. "I shouldn't have said what I said. It was unprofessional." Jacob looked up at her. She wasn't meeting his eyes. She was staring at the counter, at her own hands, at anything but him. The apology felt hollow, performative, something she was saying because Claire Whitmore was standing 3 feet away and watching. But Jacob didn't care. He didn't need her apology. He didn't need anything from her. He turned to Claire instead. She was watching him with that same unreadable expression, and Jacob realized he didn't know what to say to her either. "Thank you" felt too small. Every phrase he could think of felt inadequate for what had just happened, for what she'd just done. "This is too much," Jacob said finally. His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me. You don't know Leo. Why would you?" "Because someone should have done it for my father," Claire said. The words came out quick and clean, like a knife cutting through something tangled. She held Jacob's gaze, and for the first time, he saw something shift in her expression. Not pity, not sympathy, something closer to recognition. The bakery fell silent again. Even the couple near the wedding cake had stopped pretending to look at anything else. They were watching now, openly, and Jacob felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing pressing down on his shoulders. Claire took a breath, then continued, her voice quieter now, but no less steady. "When I was 7 years old, my father took me to a bakery for my birthday. We didn't have much money. My mother had left us the year before, and he was working 2 jobs just to keep us in a 1-bedroom apartment in the worst part of town. But it was my birthday, and he wanted to get me a cake." She stopped, and Jacob saw her hands tighten into fists at her sides, just for a moment, before she relaxed them again. He asked the same question you just asked, almost word for word, and the person behind the counter laughed at him, told him to leave, told him we didn't belong there. Jacob's chest felt like it was caving in. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if he should say anything at all. Claire wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring past him, at something only she could see. "We went home without a cake that year," Claire said. "My father cried in the bathroom that night. I heard him through the door. I was 7 years old, and I didn't understand why anyone would be that cruel to someone just for being poor." She looked at Jacob again, and her eyes were hard now, sharp as cut glass. "But I understand now. And I decided a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to do something about it, I would." The words settled over the bakery like snow. No one moved. No one spoke. Jacob stood there holding the cake box, and he felt something breaking apart inside him, something he'd been holding together with sheer force of will for the past 2 years. "This isn't about charity," Claire said again, softer this time. "This is about making sure your son gets to blow out his candles tonight. That's all." Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His throat had closed up completely. He tried again, forcing air through his lungs, but all that came out was a sound that wasn't quite a word. And then, before he could stop it, before he could push it back down where it belonged, he started to cry. It happened fast. One moment he was standing there holding the cake box, and the next his vision was blurring, and his shoulders were shaking and he couldn't make it stop. He turned away from Claire, from Sarah, from the couple who were still watching, and he pressed one hand against his face, trying to hold himself together. But it was too late. The tears came anyway, hot and sudden, and they brought everything with them. He thought about Leo, about the way his son had looked at him that morning over breakfast, when Jacob had promised him a real birthday party this year. He thought about Emma, about the way she used to bake cakes from scratch, the kitchen smelling like vanilla and brown sugar, Leo sitting on the counter, licking batter from a wooden spoon. He thought about standing in the cemetery 2 years ago with a 6-year-old who didn't understand why his mother wasn't coming home. And he thought about this morning, about waking up and realizing it had been exactly 730 days since he'd lost her. And today was supposed to be about celebrating Leo's life, but all Jacob could feel was the weight of everything he couldn't give his son. A stable home, a mother, a father who didn't have to ask for expired cake. "I'm sorry," Jacob managed to say through the tightness in his throat. "I'm sorry. I don't usually." "Don't apologize," Claire said. Her voice was firm but not unkind. "You have nothing to apologize for." Jacob wiped at his face with the back of his hand, still holding the cake box carefully with the other. He took a shaky breath, then another, trying to pull himself back together. When he finally looked up, Claire was still standing there, and her expression had softened just slightly at the edges. "Today isn't just Leo's birthday," Jacob said quietly. The words came out before he could stop them, spilling out in a rush. "It's the day my wife died. 2 years ago today. Emma. She was in a car accident on her way to pick up Leo from daycare. He was 4. He doesn't really remember her anymore. Not the way I do, and I don't know how to—" He stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't know how to make Leo understand that birthdays would always be complicated now, always tangled up with grief and guilt, and the feeling that celebrating anything was somehow wrong. Claire didn't say anything for a long moment. She just watched him, and Jacob felt like she could see every broken piece of him laid out on the floor between them. Then she stepped closer, just one step, and when she spoke, her voice was low enough that only he could hear. "One day, your son will remember who you were today," Claire said. "He won't remember the cake. He won't remember this bakery, but he'll remember that you didn't give up on him, even when it hurt." even when you had nothing left. She held his gaze, steady and unwavering. That's what matters. That's what he'll carry with him. Jacob felt his throat close up again, but he forced himself to nod. He couldn't speak. He didn't trust his voice. So he just stood there, holding the cake box like it was the most precious thing he'd ever been given. And he let Claire's words settle into the hollow places inside him. Jacob took a step back from Claire, then another, creating distance between himself and the moment that had just cracked him open in front of strangers. He wiped at his face one more time, harder than necessary, as if he could erase the fact that he'd broken down in the middle of a bakery. The shame came flooding back now, hot and heavy, settling in his stomach like something rotten. He'd been seen, completely. Not just his worn jacket and empty wallet, but the raw grief underneath, the exhaustion that came from trying to be two parents at once, the fear that he was failing Leo every single day. Claire Whitmore had looked at him and seen all of it, and Jacob didn't know if he could stand here any longer knowing that. "I should go," Jacob said. His voice came out rough and uneven. He adjusted his grip on the cake box, careful not to tilt it, and forced himself to meet Claire's eyes one more time. "Thank you. I don't know what else to say, but thank you." Claire nodded, but she didn't move. She stood there with her arms at her sides, watching him with that same steady gaze that had started all of this. Behind her, Sarah was pretending to organize something on the counter, and the couple near the wedding cake had finally looked away, murmuring to each other in low voices that Jacob couldn't make out. Jacob turned toward the door, but before he could take more than 2 steps, Claire spoke again. "Wait." He stopped. The word hadn't been loud, but it carried the same weight as everything else she'd said. Jacob turned back, and Claire was reaching into her coat pocket. For a moment, Jacob's stomach dropped, thinking she was about to pull out cash, about to offer him money on top of the cake, and he didn't know if he could handle that without completely falling apart. But Claire didn't pull out money. She pulled out a business card, plain white with black lettering, and held it out toward him. "I'm not giving you this because I think you need charity," Claire said before Jacob could refuse. "I'm giving you this because I invest in people. That's what I do, and I've been doing it long enough to recognize when someone is worth investing in." Jacob stared at the card. He didn't reach for it. "I don't understand." Claire took a step closer and placed the card on top of the cake box, right next to the ribbon. "My company funds small businesses and community programs. We also run a job placement network for skilled workers. Construction, manufacturing, trades." She met his eyes. "If you're looking for work, call that number. Someone will answer." Jacob looked down at the card, at the embossed letters that spelled out Whitmore Capital Group, and a phone number he knew he'd never forget, even if he wanted to. His hands trembled slightly where they gripped the cake box. "I'm not offering you anything you haven't earned," Claire continued. "I'm offering you a chance to earn more. There's a difference." Jacob's throat worked, but he couldn't find words. He just nodded once and carefully tucked the business card into his jacket pocket without looking at it again. If he looked at it, if he thought too hard about what it might mean, he was afraid he'd start crying again, and he couldn't do that twice in one afternoon. "Go home," Claire said, and her voice had softened into something that almost sounded gentle. "Your son is waiting." Jacob nodded again. This time he managed to speak, though his voice came out barely louder than a whisper. "Why did you do this? Really?" Claire was quiet for a moment, and Jacob saw something flicker across her face. Something that looked like old pain resurfacing before being pushed back down. When she answered, her words came slowly, carefully chosen. "Because my father never forgot that birthday," Claire said. "And I never forgot the way people looked at us, like we were less than human because we didn't have money." Her jaw tightened. "I built my company so I'd never be in that position again. But more than that, I built it so I could make sure other people didn't have to go through what we went through." Jacob swallowed hard. "Your father, is he?" "He passed away 3 years ago," Claire said. The words were matter of fact, but Jacob heard the weight behind them. "Heart attack. He got to see me succeed at least. Got to see that everything he sacrificed wasn't for nothing." "I'm sorry," Jacob said, and he meant it. He knew what it was like to lose someone who mattered, to carry their absence around like a stone in his chest. Claire shook her head slightly. "Don't be sorry. Be present for your son. That's what matters." She gestured toward the cake box. "Take that home. Light those 6 candles. Sing the song. Let him make a wish. That's what birthdays are for." Jacob nodded. He didn't trust himself to say anything else. He turned toward the door again, and this time Claire didn't stop him. But as he reached for the handle, she spoke one last time. "One day, your son will remember who you were today." Jacob looked back at her. Claire stood in the middle of the bakery, surrounded by glass cases full of perfect cakes and pastries that cost more than he made in a week. But she didn't look like she belonged to this place any more than he did. She looked like someone who'd fought her way up from somewhere dark and hadn't forgotten what the bottom looked like. "He won't remember the cake," Claire said. "He won't remember this bakery, or the woman who worked here, or what any of this looked like. But he'll remember that you showed up for him, that you were willing to set aside your pride, to ask for help, to do whatever it took to make him smile on his birthday. That's what he'll carry with him for the rest of his life." The words settled over Jacob like a blanket, warm and heavy. He felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes again, but he blinked them back. He'd cried enough for one day. Now he needed to get home. He needed to see Leo. "Thank you," Jacob said one more time. The words felt inadequate, too small to contain everything he was feeling, but they were all he had. "Thank you for seeing me." Claire's expression softened, just for a moment, and she nodded. "Go home, Jacob." He pushed through the glass door and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight. The air outside was cooler than he expected, and it felt good against his flushed face. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, adjusting his grip on the cake box, making sure it was level, and then he started walking. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. Jacob walked carefully, avoiding cracks in the sidewalk, keeping the cake box as steady as possible. People passed him on the street, rushing to wherever they needed to be, and none of them looked at him. He was invisible again, just another person carrying a bakery box, and that was fine. That was normal. That was what he needed right now. When he reached the bus stop, he sat down on the bench and placed the cake box carefully on his lap. He pulled out his phone and checked the time. 3:45. Leo should be home by now. Mrs. Patterson from downstairs had agreed to watch him until Jacob got back, and she'd probably already sent him upstairs. Jacob pulled out the business card from his jacket pocket and turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of the thick cardstock, the raised lettering. It felt real. It felt like possibility. But he was afraid to hope too much, afraid to let himself believe that one afternoon could change anything. He tucked it back into his pocket and watched the street for the bus. The bus arrived 7 minutes later. Jacob boarded carefully, paid his fare with the last of his coins, and found a seat near the back where he could hold the cake box on his lap without anyone bumping into it. Through the window, he watched the city slide past. They crossed through downtown, past the buildings where people like Claire Whitmore worked in offices he'd never see, and then into the neighborhoods where people like him lived. The apartment building came into view 20 minutes later. Jacob stood, gripped the cake box with both hands, and made his way to the front of the bus. The driver nodded at him as he stepped off, and Jacob nodded back. Then he was standing on the sidewalk outside his building, looking up at the 4th floor window where he knew Leo was waiting. He climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing, the other holding the cake box level. By the time he reached the 4th floor, his legs were burning and he was breathing hard, but the cake was still perfect. He could see it through the clear plastic window in the top of the box, The chocolate frosting hadn't smudged. The candles were still standing straight. Leo's name was still written in perfect script across the top. Mrs. Patterson's door opened before Jacob could knock. She was a woman in her 70s, with gray hair and kind eyes, and she'd been watching Leo after school for the past 6 months whenever Jacob needed help. She took one look at the cake box and smiled. "Well, would you look at that?" Mrs. Patterson said. "That's a proper birthday cake, that is." "Is Leo upstairs?" Jacob asked. "I sent him up just a few minutes ago. Told him you'd be home any minute." She looked at Jacob more closely, and her smile softened. "You doing all right, dear?" Jacob nodded. He didn't trust his voice. Mrs. Patterson patted his arm, the gesture brief but warm, and then stepped back into her apartment. Jacob continued up the stairs to his own door, fishing his keys out of his pocket with one hand, while balancing the cake box with the other. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms, and a living room that doubled as a kitchen, but it was clean, and it was theirs. Leo was sitting on the couch watching cartoons, but he jumped up the moment he heard the door open. "Dad!" Leo ran toward him, and Jacob quickly set the cake box down on the small table near the door before his son could crash into him. Leo wrapped his arms around Jacob's waist and squeezed tight. "Mrs. Patterson said you went to get a surprise." Jacob knelt down so he was eye level with his son. Leo had Emma's eyes, brown and bright and full of questions. He had her smile too, wide and genuine, and every time Jacob looked at him, he saw her reflected back. "Happy birthday, buddy," Jacob said. He reached over and pulled the cake box closer. "I got you something special." Leo's eyes went wide when Jacob opened the box. He stared at the cake like he couldn't quite believe it was real. "Is that for me?" "All for you," Jacob said. "Well, I might have a slice, but mostly for you." Leo reached out one hand, then pulled it back, like he was afraid touching the cake would make it disappear. "It has my name on it." "It does," Jacob said. "And 6 candles. 1 for each year. Can we light them now?" Leo looked up at Jacob with so much hope in his eyes that Jacob felt his chest tighten again. "Absolutely," Jacob said. He stood and carried the cake box to the small kitchen counter, then found a lighter in the drawer. He lit each candle carefully, watching the small flames flicker to life. When all 6 were burning, he turned off the overhead light, and the apartment dimmed into something softer, warmer. "Make a wish," Jacob said. Leo closed his eyes and scrunched up his face in concentration. Jacob watched him, memorizing this moment, the way the candlelight caught in his son's hair, the serious expression on his 6-year-old face. Then Leo opened his eyes, leaned forward, and blew out all 6 candles in one breath. "What did you wish for?" Jacob asked. Leo grinned up at him. "Can't tell you." "Then it won't come true." Jacob laughed, a real laugh that surprised him with how good it felt. "Fair enough." They ate cake on the couch, just the 2 of them, and Leo told Jacob about his day at school, about the drawing he'd made in art class and the game they'd played at recess. Jacob listened to every word, present in a way he hadn't been in weeks, and he realized that Claire had been right. Leo wouldn't remember the bakery. He wouldn't remember the woman behind the counter or the business card in Jacob's pocket. But he'd remember this: his father showing up, his father keeping his promise, his father making sure his birthday mattered. And maybe, Jacob thought, that was enough. Maybe that was all it had ever needed to be.